There is something most people never notice about high performers. They do something that looks strange to everyone else, and it reveals everything about why they succeed. They choose difficulty before they have to. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way they announce. But if you watch them carefully, you see the pattern. A CEO blocks time on his calendar, not for urgent meetings, but for problems that don't exist yet. An athlete trains in conditions worse than competition. A leader takes on projects that scare her before she's forced into a corner. A trader runs scenarios for market conditions that may never arrive. Most people would see this and think, why are they making their life harder? But that question reveals the gap between how ordinary people think and how successful people think. Most of us operate by a simple rule. Minimize difficulty until difficulty finds us. We avoid challenge. We choose comfort. We delay hard conversations. We wait until the crisis forces action. We believe that if we can keep things easy today, we're winning. And then something unexpected happens. A competitor moves faster, a market shifts, a relationship breaks down, and suddenly we're forced to operate at full capacity with no rehearsal. The pressure comes and we're improvising under stress. High performers operate by a different logic entirely. They understand something that most people miss. Difficulty is inevitable, but the timing and terms of that difficulty are not. They cannot eliminate challenge from their lives, but they can choose when it arrives and under what conditions, and that choice changes everything. This is not about being tough or having a high pain threshold. This is about something more fundamental. It is about understanding that capacity is built through exposure, not protected through avoidance. The person who has never failed at anything is not the most capable person in the room. They are the most fragile. They are one failure away from complete collapse because failure has no framework, no reference point. High performers have it backwards from everyone else. They see difficulty as information. They see it as a tool. They see it as something that, if you engage with it on your own terms, makes you less vulnerable to it later. Most people see difficulty as a threat to be escaped. There is a principle underneath all of this. It's called antifragility. This is not just resilience, which is bouncing back from something bad. Antifragility is improving because of the bad thing. It is the rare property of systems that get stronger under stress. A muscle tears and grows back stronger. An immune system faces a pathogen and becomes more robust. A business survives a recession and discovers efficiencies that make it more competitive. But here is what most people miss. You cannot build antifragility through safety. You build it through exposure, strategic, deliberate exposure. To difficulty you choose, under conditions you can control, before the consequences become permanent. Watch how high performers actually live this out. A senior executive I worked with made a habit of running quarterly reviews for projects that were not in crisis. Why? Not because the projects were broken, but because he wanted to find problems before they became real. He was not reacting to failure. He was inoculating himself against the surprise of failure. He had built a system that turned hypothetical difficulty into manageable difficulty before it became catastrophic difficulty. Most people think this is paranoia. High performers know it is preparation. Or look at how elite athletes approach training. They do not train in comfortable conditions. They simulate pressure. They practice in noise and distraction. They rehearse failure scenarios. A tennis player does not practice serves to a silent, empty court. She practices serves with an opponent moving, a crowd present, a score that matters. She is not just building technical skill. She is building psychological resilience through exposure to real conditions, where failure is possible. The person who trains only in comfort will always struggle when reality introduces pressure. The person who trains under pressure will find reality manageable. Here is what is crucial. This is not about suffering for its own sake. This is not about being miserable or choosing pain out of some twisted sense of virtue. It is strategic. It is intentional. The difficulty is chosen because it builds a specific capacity, and that capacity has real value when the actual stakes arrive. Most people believe that comfort equals progress. A smooth career means you are succeeding. A smooth relationship means it is healthy. A smooth decision means you made the right choice. But high performers know this is backwards. Comfort is often a signal that you are operating below your capability. Comfort is sometimes a warning sign that you are about to become irrelevant. The hidden pattern is this: successful people are willing to be uncomfortable in small, chosen ways so that they are never forced to be desperate in catastrophic ways. They distribute difficulty across time and context. They inoculate themselves. They rehearse. And because they rehearse, when real pressure arrives, they do not panic. They do not freeze. They do not feel like they are drowning. They feel like they are performing something they have already done before, even if the specifics are new. The psychological signature is familiar. The capacity is built. The framework exists. This is why you see high performers stay calm in situations that destroy other people. It is not because they are smarter or braver in some innate way. It is because they have deliberately built systems that expose them to difficulty before the stakes become life-changing. They have already failed in small ways. They have already experienced pressure in controlled contexts. So when the real test arrives, the emotional terrain is not foreign. Most people mistake this for talent. They do not see the architecture underneath. They do not see the years of voluntary discomfort. They only see the moment when a high performer handles crisis with grace and think they must be naturally gifted at this. What they are actually seeing is the result of intentional, strategic difficulty-seeking over months and years. The listener is starting to get it now. The question shifts from, why would they do this, to something deeper. What do they understand that I don't? Because that is where the real advantage lives. It is in the understanding, it is in the principle that turns difficulty from something to escape into something to seek. That principle is what we are going to unpack. But before we go there, we need to see how deep this pattern actually runs. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It appears everywhere. In every domain where people excel, this is present. Start with your own experience. Think about a skill you actually possess, something you are genuinely good at. Now trace back to how you got there. The pattern is almost always the same. You sought it. You encountered difficulty. You stayed with it, and that repetition built capacity. You did not become good at something by avoiding it. You became good by moving toward it repeatedly, even when it was hard. Now think about the reverse. Think about something you avoid, something that makes you uncomfortable. Notice what happens. You stay exactly where you started. No growth, no capacity, just the same anxiety year after year. The avoidance itself is the trap. It protects you from discomfort today and ensures you will be overwhelmed by it tomorrow. Most people know this intellectually, but knowing it and operating by it are different things. Knowing something is true and building your life around it are different things. Here is where it gets interesting. High performers do not just accept this principle, they weaponize it. They take the idea that difficulty builds capacity and they systematize it. They make it part of how they operate. A founder I worked with built this into her company culture. Every quarter, she would assign people to projects that were slightly beyond their current capability. Not so far beyond that, it was catastrophic, but beyond their comfort zone. And here is the crucial part. She did this before it was necessary. She did not wait for someone to fail at their current role. She did not wait for a crisis to force growth. She proactively placed people in difficulty. Was this popular? No. People complained. They felt stretched. But 3 years later, that company had built something most companies never build. A team where people could operate across multiple contexts without freezing. Because they had been systematically inoculated against the panic that comes with new difficulty. That is the pattern. Difficulty is not random. It is architected. High performers build it into their systems deliberately. Most people see difficulty as something that happens to you. High performers see it as something you build, and that shift in perception changes everything about how you operate in the world. Think about what this means for your own life. Think about where you are stagnant, where you are not growing, where you feel stuck. The pattern tells you something specific. You are protecting yourself from something. You are avoiding a particular kind of difficulty, and because you are avoiding it, you are not building the capacity to handle it. The change happens the moment you see this, the moment you realize that your stagnation is not because you lack talent or opportunity. It is because you have built a system of avoidance, and that system is more powerful than your talent. No amount of natural ability will overcome a belief that you should stay comfortable. Here is the thing most people never articulate. Difficulty is not the problem. Unprepared difficulty is the problem. Difficulty that arrives as a surprise is catastrophic, but difficulty that you have chosen, rehearsed, and prepared for, that is education. That is training. That is the forge where capability gets built. A trader I knew operated with this principle. He would deliberately take positions that made him uncomfortable, not recklessly, but positions that stretched his risk tolerance. Why? Because he wanted to know how he behaved under pressure before the pressure was forced on him by market conditions. He was not trying to get rich. He was trying to build psychological resilience. He was trying to know his own limits before those limits were tested by reality. Did he sometimes lose money on these deliberate risks? Yes, but he saw those losses as tuition, as the cost of an education that was worth far more than the money he spent. He was buying capacity. Most traders never think this way. They manage positions defensively, trying to protect capital, and then one day the market moves in a way they have never experienced, and they panic. They make irrational decisions. They blow up. Because they have never rehearsed this scenario. They have never deliberately stepped into their own discomfort. This is the principle that most people miss entirely. The cost of avoiding difficulty is always paid later, with interest. You can choose to pay it now on your terms, under conditions you control. Or you can defer it and pay it later, when the stakes are higher and you have no control. High performers choose to pay it now. And here is what this changes. It changes how you see your own resistance. When you feel resistance to something, when you feel the pull to avoid it, you do not see it as a warning sign anymore. You see it as information. You see it as data about where your edge is. You see it as a signal about where capacity is waiting to be built. Most people interpret resistance as a sign to stop. High performers interpret it as a sign to lean in. Same feeling, different meaning, different action, different result. The pattern runs deeper than most people understand. It is not just about pushing yourself harder or having more discipline. It is about a fundamental understanding of how humans grow. We grow in proportion to the difficulty we voluntarily accept. There is no exception to this. In every domain, in every context, the growth edge is at the boundary of discomfort. Comfort is where learning stops. Difficulty is where it starts. And once you see this, you start noticing it everywhere. In every person who excels, there is evidence of this pattern. Strategic difficulty seeking, intentional discomfort, a system that creates pressure before pressure is necessary. The question shifts now from understanding the pattern to understanding why. Why would anyone do this if they do not have to? What is the psychology underneath? What do they believe about themselves and their capacity that makes this seem like the rational choice? That is where we are heading next. Let us look at this pattern in a different context, because the principle works everywhere. It does not just show up in trading or athletics or corporate strategy. It shows up in leadership, in communication, in how people build influence. Most leaders wait until they have to lead before they lead. They get promoted, and then they figure out how to operate at that level. They are thrown into the deep end and they learn to swim. Some drown, some eventually figure it out, but they are all starting from improvisation. High performers do something different. Before they have formal authority, they practice leading. They seek out situations where they can make decisions, take responsibility, influence others, all before it is their job. A person who wants to move into a leadership role will often volunteer to lead a small project or organize a team initiative or take point on something where the stakes are low, but the leadership required is real. They are building the psychological framework of leadership before they have the title. Why? Because they understand something crucial. The moment you have the title, the moment people are actually reporting to you, the moment the stakes are real, that is not when you want to be learning how to lead. That is when you want to be drawing from experience. You want to have already failed at leadership in low-stakes contexts. You want to know your own blind spots. You want to have already made mistakes and corrected them. The person who waits until they get the title is always operating one step behind. They are learning in real time on real people with real consequences. The person who practiced leading before they had to is operating from a different place. They are executing knowledge they have already gained. Now look at communication. Most people avoid difficult conversations until they have no choice. They avoid giving feedback. They avoid saying no. They avoid raising a perspective that might create friction. And then one day they must have a difficult conversation. And it goes catastrophically because they have never practiced it. They freeze. They say the wrong thing. They damage the relationship. High performers seek out difficult conversations on purpose, not dramatically, but strategically. They give feedback to people before feedback is critical. They practice saying no. They voice unpopular perspectives in settings where the stakes are lower. They are building psychological stamina around the discomfort of conflict before conflict becomes unavoidable. A manager I worked with made this part of her practice. Every month, she would have at least one conversation with a team member about something sensitive. Not because there was a crisis, but because she was training herself. She was building the muscle of honest communication. And because she had practiced it, when real issues arose, she was not panicking. She was drawing from a reservoir of experience. Most people think this creates more conflict. The opposite is true. The person who practices difficult conversations early creates fewer total conflicts because the small ones get resolved before they become large ones. But more than that, the person who is comfortable with discomfort around communication becomes the person people trust most, because they are willing to say what others only think. Here is what ties all of these together. High performers are building capacity in advance of necessity. They are not waiting for the crisis to arrive before they build the skill. They are not waiting for the failure to happen before they learn how to recover. They are not waiting for the difficult moment to practice the difficult skill. This is the opposite of how ordinary people operate. Ordinary people practice in the comfortable spaces. They get good at things that are easy. Then when things get hard, they have no capacity. The gap between their capability and their need suddenly widens, and they fall through it. High performers narrow that gap deliberately. They practice in the hard spaces. They build capacity where capacity is scarce. And because they do this over time, systematically, they develop something that looks to outsiders like natural talent, but is actually the result of deliberate preparation. But here is the thing that most people miss. This is not just about skill. It is about identity. It is about who you see yourself as. When you practice difficult things, when you deliberately seek discomfort, you start to see yourself differently. You start to become the kind of person who handles hard things. You start to build confidence that is not based on external validation. It is based on knowing, actually knowing, not hoping that you can handle what comes. Most people build their confidence on external things. I am successful because I have this title. I am capable because people praised me. I am worthy because I achieved this outcome. But that confidence is fragile. It is tied to things outside your control. The moment circumstances shift, the confidence collapses. High performers build confidence on internal evidence. I know I can handle hard things because I have deliberately handled hard things. I know I can learn because I have learned in difficult contexts. I know I can recover because I have already failed and recovered. That confidence does not depend on external circumstances. It depends on who you know yourself to be. And that is when the pattern becomes unstoppable. Because once you are someone who seeks difficulty, who practices in discomfort, who builds capacity in advance, that identity starts to shape everything. It shapes how you spend your time. It shapes what opportunities you see. It shapes how you respond to setbacks. You are operating from a completely different internal framework. Most people are operating from, I hope things stay comfortable. High performers are operating from, I can handle what comes. Same world, different operating system. The question now is not just why they do this. The question is, what changed about how they think? What shifted in their psychology that made them interpret difficulty as opportunity instead of threat? What decision pattern do they use that most people miss? That is where the real understanding lives. There is a decision pattern hidden underneath all of this. And once you see it everywhere. It is the pattern that separates people who grow from people who stagnate. Most people make decisions based on comfort. This sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but it is worth examining. When faced with a choice, most people choose the option that feels better right now. Easier, simpler, less friction, and they dress this up as wisdom. They say they are being practical or realistic or protecting themselves, but the decision pattern is identical. Maximize comfort today. High performers use a different decision pattern entirely. When faced with a choice, they ask a different question. They do not ask, which option feels better today? They ask, which option builds capacity that I will need later? They are making decisions based on long-term optionality, not short-term comfort. These are two completely different ways of navigating the world. Here is what is crucial. Both people think they are being rational. Both people think they are making the smart choice. A person who avoids difficulty believes they are being prudent. A person who seeks difficulty believes they are being smart. The difference is not in intelligence. It is in time horizon. Most people are operating on a short time horizon, days, weeks, maybe months. The question is, what feels best right now? In that context, avoiding difficulty is rational. Difficulty does not feel good, so it makes sense to avoid it. The logic is flawless given the time frame. High performers are operating on a longer time horizon, years, decades. They are asking, who do I need to become? And what capacity do I need to build? And what will I regret not knowing how to do? In that context, seeking difficulty is rational, because difficulty now means capacity later. The logic is equally flawless, just applied to a longer timescale. This is one of the clearest divisions you can make between two types of people, not smart versus stupid. Not brave versus cowardly, but short-term focused versus long-term focused. And here is where it gets interesting. Most people do not realize they are making this choice. They think they are just being practical. They think difficulty is actually something to avoid because it feels bad. They do not see that they are optimizing for a short-time horizon. They think it is just the truth about how life works. High performers do not feel that difficulty is less uncomfortable. They feel it exactly as much as anyone else, but they have made a decision to value the long-term outcome more than the short-term comfort. That decision is the whole thing. That decision reverses the entire calculus. Think about your own life. Think about areas where you are stuck, where you are not growing. Trace that back. Almost always, the pattern is this. You have optimized for comfort. You have organized your life around avoiding friction. And because you have done that, you have not built the capacity to move beyond where you are. Now think about areas where you have grown, where you have developed genuine capability. Trace that back. The pattern is almost always, you did something that was uncomfortable, you stayed with it, and through that repetition, capacity was built. The person who wants to become a better communicator could study communication theory. That is comfortable. You read articles in your free time, or they could join Toastmasters and give speeches in front of people. That is uncomfortable. Your hands shake. People watch you stumble, but one builds knowledge, the other builds actual capability. One is optimizing for comfort, the other is optimizing for capacity. A product manager wanted to understand customer psychology better. She could have read books about user behavior. That is comfortable research. Or she could have spent 2 hours a week calling customers and asking them hard questions. That is uncomfortable. Some customers are rude, some do not want to talk. But one gives information, the other gives intuition. One is comfortable, the other builds real understanding. She chose the uncomfortable path, and within 6 months, she had developed a depth of customer insight that was rare in her organization. The decision pattern is the same every time. When you face a choice between comfort and capacity, between ease and growth, between what feels good and what makes you better, high performers choose the latter, not because they enjoy discomfort, but because they have made a decision that the long-term outcome matters more than the short-term feeling. Most people have not made that decision, or they have made it intellectually but not operationally. They say they care about growth, but when faced with an actual choice, they choose comfort. The gap between their stated values and their actual decisions reveals where they really stand. Here is what this connects to about human nature. We are wired for comfort. Our nervous system is optimized to seek safety and avoid pain. This is not a flaw. It is adaptive. In environments where survival is uncertain, this reflex keeps you alive. But in modern environments where survival is assured, this same wiring can become a prison. It keeps you safe. It also keeps you small. High performers have not eliminated this wiring. They have not become immune to discomfort. They have simply overridden it with a more powerful decision. A decision about who they want to become. And that decision is stronger than the comfort reflex. That is the psychology underneath. That is what separates them. Now here is where this becomes practical. Because understanding the psychology is one thing, but understanding how it actually changes how someone operates in real situations is different. When a high performer encounters something difficult, their internal response is different from ordinary people at a fundamental level. It is not just that they choose to engage with it, it is that they interpret it differently before the choice even happens. Most people interpret difficulty as a sign of danger. Something is hard, so something is wrong. If it was right, it would be easier. This interpretation is immediate and automatic. It happens before conscious thought. And it generates an emotional response. Anxiety, avoidance, maybe shame. Why can't I do this easily? This must not be for me. High performers interpret difficulty as a sign of growth. Something is hard, so something is being built. The difficulty is information. It is feedback that you are at the edge of your capability. And the edge of your capability is exactly where growth happens. So difficulty becomes a signal to lean in, not pull back. Same stimulus, different interpretation, different emotion, different action. This is profound because it means they are not just choosing differently. They are literally seeing the situation differently. The difficulty is not objective. It is interpreted, and their interpretation includes capacity building. It includes growth. It includes the assumption that this is workable even if it is hard. A designer I worked with illustrated this perfectly. She was tasked with redesigning a core product feature. This was genuinely difficult work. The constraints were tight. The stakeholders had conflicting needs. The current solution had been in place for years. Most designers would have felt the weight of this difficulty as burden. This is too hard. There are too many constraints. This is impossible. She felt the difficulty, but she interpreted it differently. This is exactly the kind of problem that builds real design capability. The constraints are not limitations. They are the forge where good design gets created. She spent 3 weeks in deep work, hard work, uncomfortable work, and she came out the other side with a solution that was genuinely innovative. Not because she was a genius, but because she had interpreted the difficulty as an opportunity to build something real. The person who had interpreted it as impossible would have either delivered something mediocre or quit. The person who interpreted it as growth delivered something exceptional. But here is the deeper thing. This interpretation is not just about the work itself. It is about identity. When you interpret difficulty as growth, you are implicitly saying, I am the kind of person who grows through difficulty. You are claiming an identity, and once you claim it, everything shifts. Identity is more powerful than circumstances. A person who sees themselves as capable will interpret setbacks as temporary feedback. A person who sees themselves as incapable will interpret the same setback as evidence that they lack talent. Same event, different interpretation. Based on identity, high performers have built an identity around difficulty. I am someone who seeks growth. I am someone who gets stronger through challenge. I am someone who improves when the work gets hard. That identity is not fragile. It is reinforced every time they encounter difficulty and work through it. Most people have built an identity around comfort. I am someone who works well in the right conditions. I am someone who needs to feel good to perform. I am someone who is effective when things flow easily. That identity is equally powerful, and it is equally self-reinforcing. Every time they avoid difficulty, they confirm it. The framework that ties this together is worth naming. It is the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. But that phrase has become so familiar that people miss the actual power underneath. It is not just about believing you can improve. It is about a complete reorganization of how you interpret the world. When you operate from a growth mindset, difficulty is feedback about where capacity is being built. Failure is information about what you have not yet learned. Competition is an opportunity to measure yourself against a higher standard. Criticism is data about how to improve. The same events that demoralize someone with a fixed mindset actually energize someone with a growth mindset. But here is what most people miss. This mindset is not something you either have or do not have. It is a choice you make repeatedly. Every time you encounter difficulty, you choose how to interpret it. Am I incapable, or am I at the edge of my capability? Am I being exposed as a fraud, or am I learning something new? Should I retreat, or should I lean in? Most people make these choices unconsciously. They make them based on habit, on what they have learned to believe about themselves, on the narratives they have been told. They do not realize they are choosing. High performers make these choices consciously. They have decided that growth matters more than comfort, and they reinforce that decision repeatedly every time they encounter difficulty. They choose the interpretation that builds them. They choose the action that develops them. And over time, through hundreds of these small choices, they build a completely different relationship with difficulty. It is no longer something to fear or avoid. It is something to seek. Not because they are masochists, but because they understand the mathematics of growth. You cannot build capacity without engaging with difficulty. That is not an opinion. That is how human development actually works. And once you accept that, the choice becomes obvious. Why would you not seek the difficulty? Why would you not be strategic about where you engage it? Why would you not build it into your life intentionally? The person asking those questions has already shifted their psychology. They have already made the choice about who they are becoming. Let us look at how this plays out over time, because understanding the single decision is one thing. Understanding how that decision compounds is where you see the real power. When someone makes the choice to seek difficulty, they are not just choosing a single difficult thing. They are choosing to enter a completely different feedback loop. And that feedback loop accelerates their development in a way that ordinary people cannot match. Here is how it works. A person chooses to do something difficult. They struggle with it. Over time, they improve. That improvement builds confidence. That confidence makes them willing to seek out the next level of difficulty, which they struggle with, which they improve at, which builds more confidence. The loop continues. Now compare this to someone operating from the comfort paradigm. They do something easy, they do it well. That success makes them want to stay in that space. They avoid things that are hard. Their confidence is high, but it is confidence in a narrow domain. Because they never leave the comfortable space, their development plateaus. The loop is broken. The gap between these two people widens over years, not because one is smarter, but because one has been systematically building capacity in an expanding domain, and the other has been systematically reinforcing the same narrow capability. After 10 years, the gap is enormous, but it did not appear suddenly. It was built through thousands of small choices about whether to seek difficulty or avoid it. This is why most people massively underestimate how far high performers have come. They look at someone at the peak of their capability and they attribute it to talent. What they do not see is the years of deliberate difficulty seeking that created that capability. They do not see the feedback loops. They do not see the compounding. A trader I know operates from this principle religiously. Every quarter, she deliberately takes on positions that are slightly scarier than she is comfortable with. Not recklessly, but at the edge. She knows this will create months where she is anxious, months where she is forced to think deeply about risk management, months where she cannot coast on past success. And because she does this systematically, her risk tolerance expands over time. Her intuition about markets sharpens. Her decision-making gets faster, not because the market's changed, but because she systematically expanded her own edge. Most traders want to find the perfect strategy and then execute it forever. High performers know that execution is just part of it. Continuous expansion of their own edge is the other part. So they structure their work to force that expansion. And because they do, they remain competitive for decades. The traders who stopped expanding become irrelevant within 5 years. This is the principle underneath every domain where people sustain excellence. Musicians do not practice the same pieces forever. They practice pieces at the edge of their current capability. Athletes do not perform the same drills. They add complexity, add speed, add pressure. Leaders do not repeat the same decisions. They take on larger scope, more ambiguity, harder problems. The pattern is identical, but here is what separates people who do this intentionally from people who just happen to get harder work over time. Intentionality creates different results. A person who gets thrown into harder work by circumstance is forced to adapt. They learn out of necessity, but they are often stressed. They are often playing catch-up. They are often scared because they did not choose the difficulty. It arrived. A person who deliberately seeks difficulty on their own terms is still stressed, still learning, still at the edge of their capability. But the stress is different. It is the stress of purpose, not the stress of panic. They chose this. They know why. They know what they are building, and that changes everything about how they experience it and what they extract from it. The person who chooses their own difficulty builds faster, learns deeper, retains more, because they are not just surviving the difficult situation. They are mining it for every insight. They are asking, what am I learning here? And how does this expand my capacity, instead of just how do I get through this? This connects to something fundamental about how humans grow. We do not develop primarily through comfort. We develop through challenge met with intention. The challenge creates the stimulus. The intention creates the learning. Without the intention, the challenge is just stress. Without the challenge, the intention is just philosophy. High performers have both. They seek challenge with intention, and that combination is what creates acceleration. Now here is where this becomes even more interesting. Once you understand this pattern, once you see it working in your own life, it starts to change how you see opportunities. You start noticing differently. A difficult project is no longer just a threat. It is a potential forge. A person who challenges you is no longer just friction. It is a whetstone. A setback is no longer just failure. It is information. And because you see these things differently, you make different choices about them. You lean into projects that scare you. You seek feedback from people who push you. You examine failures for the lessons instead of running from them. Most people do the opposite. They avoid difficult projects. They avoid people who challenge them. They avoid examining failures. So the opportunities for growth that are always present just pass them by. It is not that opportunities are scarce for high performers. It is that they interpret the exact same situations differently. Where ordinary people see threat, they see growth. Where ordinary people see friction, they see sharpening. Where ordinary people see failure, they see education. Same world, different lens. And that lens compounds over time. After years of making these different choices, of interpreting situations differently, of seeking the difficulty that others avoid, high performers have built something that looks like superhuman capability. But it is not superhuman. It is the result of a decision, a choice, a commitment to seek difficulty instead of avoid it. That commitment is the thing underneath everything else. Once that decision is made, the system builds itself. But here is what most people never see. This is not just a psychological choice happening in your head. This is something that shapes your entire system, your calendar, your relationships, your environment, your daily habits, everything. High performers do not just think differently about difficulty. They build lives where difficulty is structural. It is embedded. It is unavoidable. And because it is unavoidable, it becomes ordinary. It becomes how they operate. Think about what this actually means. If you believe that difficulty is where growth happens, then you would not organize your life to minimize it. You would organize your life to make sure it is present, regularly, strategically, in ways that you can learn from. Most people do the opposite. They organize their lives to be as frictionless as possible. They find the easiest path to what they want. They hire people to handle difficult tasks. They avoid people and situations that create friction. They try to build a life where things flow easily. And in doing so, they build a life where growth becomes optional rather than structural. High performers build friction into their systems on purpose. A CEO blocks time on her calendar, not just for urgent decisions, but for thinking about problems that do not exist yet. A writer does not just write when inspiration comes. She has a practice, a specific time, a specific place, where she shows up even when it is hard. An athlete has a training regimen designed to create discomfort, to push the edges, to build capacity that is slightly beyond what they currently need. These are not exceptions. These are systems. They are architecture. They are the result of a decision to make difficulty structural instead of leaving it to chance. And here is what is crucial. Because difficulty is structural, it becomes manageable. A person who waits for difficulty to arrive catastrophically is overwhelmed by it. A person who encounters it regularly, in small doses, in contexts they have some control over, learns to manage it. It becomes part of how they operate. This is similar to how your body adapts to physical stress. If you never exercise, even a moderately difficult hike will devastate you. Your body is unprepared. But if you exercise regularly, your body adapts. Your capacity increases. Things that once felt impossible become manageable. The difference is not your body. It is the consistent exposure to stress in manageable doses. Psychological and skill development works exactly the same way. The person who never encounters difficulty will be destroyed by it when it arrives. The person who encounters it regularly, who has built systems around it, who has learned to extract learning from it, that person remains capable. Not because they are superhuman, but because they have trained. Now look at the framework that ties this together. Most people operate by what you might call the comfort paradox. They believe that comfort equals success, but comfort is actually the enemy of growth. The more comfortable you become, the further you get from your edge. The edge is where learning happens, so comfort is actually moving you away from capability, even though it feels like it is bringing you closer to success. High performers operate by a different framework. Call it the difficulty dividend. The principle is this: short-term discomfort creates long-term optionality. You accept difficulty now in deliberate, chosen ways, and that creates capacity that you can draw from later. When real crisis arrives, you are not panicking. You are not improvising. You are performing something you have already rehearsed. The dividend is not just capability. It is something deeper. It is freedom. The person who has built capacity through deliberate difficulty is free to move in directions that terrify other people. The person who has avoided difficulty is locked into a narrow range of acceptable behavior. They are trapped by their own fragility. This is why high performers often seem fearless. They are not fearless because they do not feel fear. They are fearless because they have built so much capacity that the things other people fear seem manageable to them. They have rehearsed. They have failed. They have recovered. They know at a bone-deep level that they can handle what comes. But that knowledge is not innate. It is built. It is constructed through years of seeking difficulty, learning from it, and letting it shape who they are. Here is the thing that connects all of this. The decision pattern, the psychology, the systems, the framework, they are all manifestations of a single belief. A belief about what is possible, a belief about who you are capable of becoming, a belief that difficulty is not something to escape, but something to seek. Most people have not formed that belief. They have the opposite belief, that safety is the goal, that comfort is success, that you should avoid difficulty and it will avoid you. That belief is equally powerful, and it is equally self-reinforcing. Every time they avoid difficulty, they confirm it. But beliefs are not fixed. They can be examined. They can be changed. And the moment you change the belief, the moment you actually believe that difficulty is where you build capability, everything shifts. The world does not change. But your interpretation of it changes, and from that new interpretation flows a completely different set of choices, a completely different system, a completely different life. That shift from belief to system is what we need to examine now, because understanding the principle is one thing, but understanding how to actually live it, how to build it into your reality, how to make it operational, that is where transformation actually happens. This is where most people get stuck. They understand the principle. They see that high performers seek difficulty. They intellectually accept that this is how capacity gets built. And then they do nothing. Understanding does not translate to action. Knowing does not become doing. The gap between knowing and doing is where most people live. And closing that gap is exactly what separates people who improve from people who stay the same. So let us get specific. Let us move from principle to practice. Let us answer the question that actually matters. How do I actually do this? The first thing you need to understand is the difference between reactive difficulty and proactive difficulty. Most people only experience reactive difficulty. Life happens, something breaks, a crisis arrives, and suddenly you are forced to grow. The growth is real, but it is traumatic. It is survival mode learning, and it is inefficient. Proactive difficulty is different. You choose the difficulty, you choose the timing, you choose the context. And because you choose these things, you can set up the conditions for optimal learning. You can decide how much stress is productive and how much is just trauma. You can control the pace. You can control what you are learning. The shift from reactive to proactive is the foundational shift. It is moving from difficulty finds me to I find difficulty. And that shift changes everything. Here is what this looks like in practice. Most people wait until their communication skills are costing them something before they work on communication. A relationship breaks down, a negotiation fails, a presentation is a disaster. Then they decide to improve, and they start from panic. Proactive difficulty looks different. You start now, while the stakes are low. You join a speaking group. You schedule difficult conversations with trusted people. You ask for feedback from people you respect. You are building communication capacity before you need it, before the stakes are high, before failure has real consequences. The same principle applies everywhere. Most people do not work on leadership skills until they are promoted into a leadership role. They are learning to lead while actually leading, with real people depending on them. Proactive difficulty means you practice leading before you have to. You volunteer for projects where you can make decisions and be accountable. You lead small initiatives. You build the muscle before you need it. Now here is where this becomes systematic. There are 3 tiers of difficulty that you can build into your life intentionally. Understanding these tiers helps you structure your practice so it is effective without being overwhelming. The first tier is technical difficulty. This is skill-based challenge. It is learning something new. It is operating at the edge of your current capability in a domain. A programmer learning a new language, a manager learning financial analysis, a communicator learning to speak publicly. This is difficult because it requires focused attention and new learning. But it is bounded. It has a clear direction. It has measurable progress. The second tier is social difficulty. This is relational challenge. It is putting yourself in positions where you are visible, where you have to interact with people in ways that are uncomfortable, where you have to manage others' perceptions. This includes things like speaking in front of groups, leading meetings where you do not have all the answers, asking for help from people you want to impress, admitting mistakes in front of colleagues. This tier is harder than technical difficulty because it involves other people and it involves your identity. It is not just about learning a skill, it is about how you show up. The third tier is physical or existential difficulty. This is pushing your limits in fundamental ways. It includes things like athletic challenge, extreme discomfort, physical risk, or situations where you have to confront your own fear directly. This tier is the most intense because it involves your body and your deepest sense of safety. Not everyone needs to operate at this tier, but understanding it helps you see the full spectrum. Most people operate comfortably in Tier 1 if they do anything at all. They will take classes or read books or learn new skills. That is safe. That is technical difficulty without much social risk. But high performers distribute their practice across all 3 tiers. They are building technical capability, social confidence, and physical resilience simultaneously. Here is what this distribution looks like in real life. An executive I worked with structured her year around this framework. She took on a technical challenge. She decided to learn data science because it was not her native skill, and she knew it would matter in her role. That was Tier 1. She volunteered to speak at industry conferences about her work. That was Tier 2. And she committed to training for a half marathon, pushing her physical limits in a way she had not done in years. That was Tier 3. By year-end, she had built capacity across all 3 dimensions. Did any of these things come easily? No. Were there moments she wanted to quit? Absolutely. But because she had distributed the difficulty, no single area was overwhelming. And because she had strategically chosen what to be difficult about, the difficulty was productive. It was building specific capacity that mattered to her. Most people do not structure their growth this way. They do one thing when they have to, driven by external pressure. Or they do nothing. The systematic approach, choosing difficulty across multiple tiers, spreading it through the year, making it structural, is rare. And that rarity is exactly why it creates such a large advantage. Now, here is the practical question. Where do you start? You cannot build difficulty in every domain at once. You will overwhelm yourself. The art is choosing strategically. The answer is to look at your constraints. Where are you constrained? Not where is it hard. Constraint is different from difficulty. A constraint is something that is limiting your options, limiting your impact, limiting what is possible for you. Difficulty that removes a constraint is productive. It directly expands what becomes possible. If you are constrained in communication, that is where you build difficulty. If you are constrained in leadership, that is where you practice. If you are constrained in your technical depth, that is where you add challenge. The difficulty you choose should be aimed at removing constraints that are actually limiting you. This is crucial because it connects the abstract principle to concrete results. You are not just building capacity in general, you are removing specific limitations that are in your way. And because the difficulty is targeted, because it addresses a real constraint, the motivation is higher, the learning is deeper, the results are faster. The practice then looks like this. Identify your top constraint. Map out what tier of difficulty would address it. Design a specific practice around that constraint. Commit to it for a defined period. Then measure what changed. Did the constraint loosen? Did your options expand? Did your capability increase? That feedback is what tells you whether you are doing this right. Most people never do this systematically. They are too busy reacting to what is urgent to be intentional about what is important. But the person who steps out of the reactive cycle, who carves out space to deliberately build capacity where they are constrained, who makes it structural, that person is the one who accelerates. The question is not whether you have time to do this, it is whether you have time not to. Because if you do not deliberately build capacity where you are constrained, you stay constrained. And staying constrained means staying limited. That cost compounds. It compounds every single day. But here is what happens when you actually try to do this. This is where theory meets reality. This is where most people stop. You identify your constraint, you design the practice, you commit. And then approximately 3 days in, it gets hard. Not in theory, in actual real-life emotional difficulty, and you start to negotiate with yourself. Maybe I should wait until the timing is better. Maybe I am not ready. Maybe this constraint is not actually limiting me. Maybe I should do something easier first. This is the moment that determines everything. This is the moment where the difference between people who build capacity and people who stay the same is made. Not when things are going well, but when the difficulty is real and the discomfort is acute. Here is what you need to know about this moment. It is normal. It is not a sign that you chose wrong. It is not a sign that you are not capable. It is the difficulty working exactly as it should. Your nervous system is protesting. Your comfort reflex is screaming. This is what growth feels like from the inside. High performers do not experience less of this. They experience the same discomfort. The difference is they have decided in advance that discomfort is not a reason to stop. They have made a commitment that is stronger than the discomfort. This is why the decision needs to come first. Before the difficulty arrives, you need to have decided why you are doing this, not as an intellectual exercise, but as an actual commitment. Because when the moment comes, and it will come, you need something stronger than your comfort reflex to keep you going. Here is what this looks like in practice. A manager I worked with made a commitment to have one difficult conversation per week. A real conversation, with stakes, about something that mattered. She wrote it down. She told people about it. She made it public. And in week 2, when she was supposed to have a difficult conversation and all she wanted to do was skip it, that public commitment kept her going. Because backing out was not just about her, it was about admitting she could not do what she said she would do. That public commitment is powerful. It is a tool, not the only tool, but it matters. Another tool is tracking. You cannot manage what you do not measure, so you measure the difficulty. You track whether you did the practice. You track what you learned. You track how you felt. And because you are tracking it, you are making it real. You are not relying on memory or intention. You have data. A trader kept a journal of the difficult decisions he made. Every position he took that scared him. Every mistake he made. Every lesson he extracted. And in moments when he wanted to give up, when the difficulty felt overwhelming, he would look at that journal and see the proof that he had done this before, that he had survived, that he had learned, that the fear he was feeling now was not new. He had felt it before and gotten through it. The third tool is community. You do not have to do this alone. The person who is building capacity in isolation has only their own willpower to draw from. The person who is doing it with others, who has people who understand what they are doing, who have support and accountability, that person is drawing from a larger reservoir. This does not mean you need a formal group, though that can help. It can be as simple as one other person who is also committed to seeking difficulty. Someone you check in with, someone who asks you whether you did the practice, someone who understands why this matters. The combination of these tools, public commitment, tracking, community, creates a structure that is strong enough to carry you through the moments when your own motivation wavers. And your motivation will waver. That is not weakness. That is normal. The structure is what bridges those gaps. Here is what happens when you stay with the practice, when you move through the discomfort, when you keep going, even when it would be easier to stop. In the beginning, the difficulty is just difficulty. It is uncomfortable and you are not sure it is working. But somewhere around week 4 or 5, something shifts. The thing that felt impossible starts to feel challenging but doable. You have done it enough times that the territory is no longer completely foreign. You still feel the discomfort, but you have experience handling it now. That experience changes everything. By week 8 or 12, you have built something. Not mastery, but real, observable capacity. You can do the thing you could not do before, maybe not perfectly, but competently. And that competence is the first dividend. That is when you start to believe that this is actually working. And because you believe it is working, the next tier of difficulty becomes appealing instead of terrifying. You are ready to go deeper. The loop continues. This is the progression that most people never see because they stop before it happens. They quit in week 2 or 3 when the discomfort is acute, but the results are not yet visible. They do not stay long enough to reach the point where capacity starts showing up. The people who stay, who push through, who maintain the practice even when it is hard, those are the people who build genuine capability. And that capability is what becomes visible later. When people look at them and think they must be naturally talented, what they are actually seeing is the result of months of staying with difficulty when it would have been easier to quit. So here is what actually changes when you commit to this, not in theory, in your actual life. The first thing that changes is how you see your time. You stop seeing time as something to fill with comfort and start seeing it as something to invest in capacity. This sounds simple, but it is not. It requires a complete reorientation of how you think about what matters. Most people organize their time around urgent things and comfortable things. What is due today? What does not require much effort? Time fills up and nothing changes. You are busy, but you are not building. High performers organize their time around growth. They block time for difficulty, real time, protected time, the same way you would protect time for a critical meeting, because it is critical. It is the most important thing you can do, and because you protect it, it actually happens. A CEO I worked with changed her Monday morning. Instead of jumping into emails and urgent fires, the first 2 hours of Monday was reserved for something difficult. Sometimes it was learning something new. Sometimes it was working on a hard problem that did not have an immediate deadline. Sometimes it was getting feedback on something vulnerable. But every Monday, for those 2 hours, she was in difficulty. And because it was scheduled, because it was protected, it actually happened. Most people never do this. They say they will get to growth when things calm down. They will learn when the crisis passes. They will work on their edge when they have more time. But things never calm down. The crisis never ends. The time never opens up. So they never build capacity. They just get older, doing the same things. The second thing that changes is how you interpret feedback. Most people treat feedback as optional information, something to consider or something to defend against. High performers treat feedback as raw material for growth. It is data. It is specific information about where their edge is. When someone points out something you are doing poorly, your instinct is to defend or dismiss. But a person committed to difficulty interprets this differently. This is information. This is exactly the kind of data I need. This person is showing me where I am limited. This is valuable. This shift in interpretation is foundational because feedback, when you actually use it, becomes a map. It shows you exactly where to apply difficulty. It shows you what constraint to address next. Most people waste feedback by defending against it. The person who actually uses it accelerates. The third thing that changes is your relationship with failure. Most people see failure as something to minimize. They take risks that are manageable. They stay in their lane. They avoid situations where failure is possible. The logic is that if you never fail, you never have to experience that pain. But this logic is broken. Because avoiding failure also means avoiding growth, and the cost of avoiding growth compounds. You do not get better. You do not expand your capacity. You just get more skilled at staying small. High performers see failure as information. It is the most valuable feedback you can get. It tells you exactly where your edge is. It tells you what you need to learn. It tells you what capacity you need to build. So they do not avoid failure. They seek it out strategically. They create conditions where failure is possible, where the stakes are manageable, where they can learn from it. When you make this shift, failure stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you use. It is no longer a threat. It is a tool. The fourth thing that changes is your sense of what is possible. This is subtle but profound. When you spend months seeking difficulty, when you push yourself in deliberate ways, when you experience yourself handling things that used to terrify you, your sense of what is possible expands. You stop thinking in terms of people like me can do this and start thinking in terms of what do I need to learn to do that. The limitation shifts from identity to skill. And the gap between a limitation that is identity and a limitation that is skill is everything. One is fixed, the other is addressable. This is why high performers often seem to move faster than their peers. They are not smarter, but they believe more is possible. And belief changes what you attempt. Belief changes what you see as available. Belief changes what you are willing to invest energy in. Most people have never questioned the boundaries of what they believe is possible for them. They inherited those boundaries from their circumstances, from their family, from the stories they were told. And they live inside them. The person who questions those boundaries, who tests them, who expands them through deliberate practice, that person operates in a completely different space. This is what the practice actually builds. Not just skill, but belief. A belief that you are capable of more than you currently are. A belief that difficulty is workable. A belief that growth is possible. and that belief becomes the foundation for everything else. The transformation is not dramatic. There is no moment where you suddenly become a different person. It is gradual. It is the accumulation of small practices over time, small difficulties chosen, small failures learned from, small pieces of feedback integrated. Over months and years, you build into a completely different version of yourself. But the person at the end, the person who is committed to this practice, operates from a fundamentally different place than the person who avoids difficulty. That person is not just more skilled, they are freer, they are capable. They believe in themselves not because they have been told they are special, but because they have proven it to themselves through months of seeking and surviving and learning from difficulty. That is what the discomfort dividend actually pays. Here is what becomes clear when you see this whole pattern together. You cannot separate the principle from the psychology, from the practice. They are one system. The principle says that difficulty builds capacity. The psychology says that high performers have made a decision to value long-term growth more than short-term comfort. And the practice says that this decision becomes structural. It shapes your time, your relationships, your habits, your identity. Most people spend their lives trying to escape difficulty. They build lives designed to minimize friction, maximize comfort, avoid challenge. And in doing so, they build something that looks safe from the inside, but is actually deeply fragile. Because when real difficulty arrives, and it always arrives, they have no framework, no rehearsal, no evidence that they can handle it. They panic. High performers build lives that actively embrace difficulty. They seek it out, they study it, they use it. They know that the discomfort now is the cost of the capability later. And because they pay that cost consistently, when real pressure arrives, they do not crumble. They perform. The gap between these two ways of living is not small. It compounds every day. Every time someone avoids difficulty, they reinforce their own fragility. Every time a high performer seeks it, they build their own resilience. After months, the gap is visible. After years, it is undeniable. But here is what matters right now, in this moment. That gap does not have to define you. It is not fixed. It is the result of choices. And you can make different choices starting today. You can identify one constraint that is limiting you, one area where you are smaller than you need to be, and you can commit to building difficulty around that constraint, not dramatically, not all at once, but strategically, systematically, over time. You can decide that short-term discomfort is worth long-term capability. You can decide that growth matters more than comfort. You can decide that difficulty is not something to escape, but something to seek. And the moment you make that decision, the moment it becomes real in your life, not just in your head, everything shifts. Your time gets organized differently. Your choices shift. Your relationships shift. Your identity begins to rebuild itself around someone who seeks growth instead of someone who seeks comfort. That person, the person who has made this decision and is living it, is unstoppable. Not because they are superhuman, but because they have decided that difficulty is not something that happens to them. It is something they use. The discomfort dividend is real. It is paid every time you stay with something that is hard, every time you seek feedback that stings, every time you fail in a way that teaches you, every time you choose growth over comfort. And the dividend keeps compounding until one day you realize you can do things that once seemed impossible, not because you were born with special talent, but because you made a decision, you sought difficulty, you stayed with it, you learned from it. And now difficulty does not frighten you anymore. It excites you because you know what it means. It means growth is coming. That is the invisible edge that separates people who merely survive from people who genuinely thrive.